I had been waiting in worse places than the Anseth crossing, but not many, and not for longer. The concourse was a long, pale hall built for things taller than me, with ceilings that vanished into a haze of indoor weather and floors of some seamless gray material that took the light and gave nothing back. They kept it bright in there. The Velnar liked their public spaces lit like an operating theater, every corner accounted for, no shadow deep enough to hide a knife or an opinion. It made the place feel honest in a way that wasn't honest at all. I had spent 40 years learning that the rooms with the most light are usually the ones with the most to watch. I found a bench against the far wall, low enough that my knees thanked me, and I sat. Boone lay down beside me without being told. He was good about that. He had always been good about that. He circled once out of old habit, sighed the long sigh of a dog who has decided the day is going to be longer than he'd hoped, and folded himself onto the floor with his chin across my boot. His weight settled over the leather like a sandbag. He was 190 pounds of English Mastiff, fawn going gray at the muzzle and gray at the brows, and when he lay down the floor noticed. A few of the travelers nearby moved their feet, not because he'd done anything, because he was large, and because they didn't know what large meant where I came from, and a thing you don't understand is always a little bigger than it is. I scratched the soft fold behind his ear, and he leaned into it without lifting his head. "We'll be home soon," I told him. He didn't believe me. He'd heard me say it on 3 transfer stations already. I'm Eli Hartman. I was a contractor most of my life, structural, then survey, then the kind of work that doesn't have a clean name, the kind where they send an old hand to a far place to look at a problem and tell them honestly whether it can be fixed or whether they ought to walk away. I was good at it because I had stopped being impressed by things a long time ago, and because I told people the truth even when it cost them money. The last contract had kept me out among the Velnar worlds for the better part of 2 years. I was 73. I was tired in the particular way you get tired when the work is done, and there is nothing left to do but go home, and you cannot get there fast enough. Boone had come with me because Boone went where I went. My wife had picked him out of a litter 11 years back, a fat scowling pup the size of a loaf of bread, and she had named him after a road we'd lived on, and she had been gone 4 years now, and the dog and I were what was left of that house. We took care of each other. That's the whole of it. People want a grander story, and there isn't one. He was an old dog, and I was an old man, and we were going home. The trouble started, as it usually does, with someone who had a uniform and not enough to do. There were 3 of them at the inspection arch when our transfer was finally called, and they wore the slate plating the Velnar Customs Service liked, segmented across the chest and shoulders so that when they moved they made a sound like coins. They were tall. Velnar run 2.5 meters, and they hold themselves straighter than they need to, the way you do when your whole culture has decided that height is the same thing as worth. The one in the center had the silver collar band of a senior officer and a face like a closed door. I stood. My knees made their report. Boone stood with me, slow, gathering himself up joint by joint the way old big dogs do, and he came to my left side and waited. I had the manifest ready. I'd had it ready for an hour. I'm an old hand at borders. You have your papers out and your hands visible, and you let the man with the authority feel like the most important person in the building, because he is, and because the alternative is worse. I held out the transit chit and the animal documentation, all of it, sealed and stamped by 3 separate authorities, because I had learned long ago that a dog crossing borders generates more paperwork than a man does. The senior officer didn't take it. He looked down at Boone. "This animal is not on the concourse register," he said. His translator gave it to me flat, no inflection, which was its own kind of inflection. "He's on the transit register," I said. "He's documented through to the Saul corridor. It's all there. He came in on this same line." The transit register and the concourse register are not the same instrument. He said it the way a man says a thing he has said 1,000 times to 1,000 tired travelers and enjoyed every one. An animal of this mass on an open concourse requires a concourse clearance. You do not have a concourse clearance. Then I'd be glad to get one, I said. Tell me where the window is and I'll stand in the line. That wasn't what he wanted. I could see it land. He had been hopping for an argument and I'd given him a yes, and a yes is a hard thing to push against. He turned to one of the others, the younger two, and there was a short exchange in the clicking under register the translators don't bother to render, and then he turned back to me. The clearance requires an assessment, he said. The animal must be assessed for threat classification before it can be cleared to the concourse. You should have arranged this before disembarking. I disembarked where they told me to disembark, I said. I went where the floor lights pointed. I've been on this bench 3 hours waiting for the call you just gave me. If there's a window I missed, point me at it and I'll go fix it. The assessment is not a window, the officer said. The assessment is a procedure. And there it was. I had heard the word asterisk procedure in 9 languages on 4 stations, and it never once meant anything good. It meant someone was about to do a thing to you that they'd already decided to do, and the word was the cushion they'd brought along so they wouldn't have to feel it. Behind him, set back from the arch in a kind of recessed bay with a heavy transparent partition, something large shifted its weight and looked at us. I'd noticed it when we came in. You notice a thing like that. It was a Grawl, I learned the word later, the licensed Apex Deterrent the bigger Velnar stations kept on hand for the kind of trouble that uniforms and sidearms aren't built for. It was 6-limbed and low and broad, the size of a draft horse but built wrong for a horse, all shoulder and jaw, hide the color of wet slate going to bone white along a ridged spine. It had a head like a wedge and small deep-set eyes, and a way of breathing that you could see across the hall, the great barrel of it filling and emptying, slow. They kept it behind the partition with a handler beside it, a wiry Velnar in a different plating, dark, and a control yoke in his hands. The Grawl had been watching the concourse the whole time the way a turret watches a field. Now it was watching Boone. I want to be careful here, because this is the part people don't believe, and I don't blame them. I didn't believe it either at first, and I was standing right there. The Grawl had been doing the thing predators do in a crowd, the slow sweep, weighing everything, finding nothing worth the trouble. And somewhere in that sweep it had crossed my dog and it had stopped. It wasn't agitated. It wasn't snarling. If anything, it had gone very still, stiller than it had been, and it had lowered its head a degree, and it was looking at Boone with an attention it had not spent on anything else in that hall, including the 3 armed officers and the 400 travelers and me. Boone was looking back. He wasn't tense. His tail wasn't up and it wasn't down. He had simply turned his big gray head and found the other animal across the room and settled his gaze on it, calm as a man reading a clock. Then he yawned, the wide, slow, jaw-cracking yawn of an old dog who has decided a thing is not urgent, and he lay back down across my boot. The Grawl kept watching the place, where he'd been standing for a good while after. The handler with the yoke had noticed. I saw him notice. He glanced from his animal to my dog and back, and his plating shifted, and he said something low to the officer at the arch, and the officer waved it off. That was the officer's first mistake, though he'd already made several. He waved off the one person in the building whose job was to read what an apex predator was telling him, because the message his apex was sending didn't fit the story he'd decided to tell. The assessment will proceed at the secure bay, the officer said to me. Bring the animal. Where's the bay? You do not accompany the animal to the assessment. The assessment is conducted by station personnel. I let a beat go by. I have found that a beat, used well, will do more than a paragraph. No, I said, pleasant. Just the word set down on the table between us like a coin. The officer's collar band caught the light as his head came around. You are refusing a customs procedure. I'm refusing to hand my dog to strangers to be taken somewhere I can't see. I'll do the assessment. I'll stand for it, he'll stand for it. You can scan him and weigh him and check his teeth and run whatever instrument you've got. Right here in the open with me holding the leash. That's reasonable, and you know it's reasonable. What you're describing isn't an assessment. It's a confiscation with a nicer word on it. I wasn't angry when I said it. That's the thing I'd want a younger man to understand if he were ever standing where I was standing. The anger doesn't help you. The anger is what they're fishing for, because an angry old man is a man who has handed them the script. I kept my voice where you'd keep it ordering coffee. I kept my hands loose. Boone, on the floor, didn't so much as flick an ear because I hadn't given him anything to flick it at. A dog reads your hands and your breath before he reads the room, and my hands and my breath were telling him there was no trouble here, only a tedious man we'd have to outlast. The officer didn't like the word confiscation. Either it was closer to the truth than he wanted said out loud in a public hall, or the translator had handed it to the travelers around us with more edge than he'd intended. I saw heads turn. A border officer's authority runs on everyone agreeing not to look too closely at it, and people were starting to look. The animal, he said, and his voice had gone harder, is undocumented apex mass on an open civilian concourse. Until it is cleared, it is a hazard. Hazards are not negotiated with. They are contained. He's a dog, I said. That word means nothing here. No, I agreed. I don't suppose it does. And that, I think, is when the whole thing tipped, though I didn't feel it tip at the time. There was a girl. I'd seen her earlier, 2 benches down, a young thing human which had surprised me because I hadn't expected to see another of my own kind on that line. A courier by the cut of her jacket and the locked case cuffed to her wrist. 19, maybe 20. She'd been nervous the whole 3 hours, the way the young get nervous in a foreign place, doing the thing where you make yourself small and hope the room forgets you're in it. It never works. The room never forgets. When the officer started raising his voice at me, she'd made the mistake of getting up. I think she meant to drift toward the boarding line, to be somewhere else when the trouble landed. But you don't move suddenly near armed men who are already wound up, and one of the younger officers, the jumpy one, the one whose plating never sat still, came off the arch and put a gauntlet on her shoulder and turned her around hard. She made a sound, not a scream, a small caught sound, the sound a person makes when a hand twice the size of theirs lands on them out of nowhere. The case on her wrist swung. The officer saw the locked case and the cuff and decided, in the way these things get decided in a quarter-second by men looking for a reason, that he'd caught something. He had her arm up behind her before she'd finished turning. She went up on her toes. She was crying now, the silent kind, and saying something about a manifest, about a bonded courier line, about please, and none of it was reaching him because he'd already stopped listening the moment his own hand closed. The senior officer turned from me toward the commotion. The third one stepped wide, and the handler at the partition, I watched him do it, put his thumb on the release of his yoke, because the protocol in a room going hot is to bring up the deterrent, and the deterrent was the growl. The partition opened. I have been in rooms that turned in an instant, and I will tell you that the worst part is always the same. It's the sound. People understand all at once and without being told that the floor has dropped out from under the ordinary, and 400 of them inhale at the same time, and that indrawn breath is a noise like the tide going out. The concourse made that noise. The travelers nearest the girl scattered backward into the ones behind them. Somebody went down. The bright, honest light showed every face, and every face had the same thing on it. The growl came out of the bay low and fast and silent, which was the most frightening part, that a thing that size could move without sound, and the handler's yoke was strung out behind it, and the handler was being half-dragged, shouting the click words that were supposed to mean asterisk halt and hold, and not getting them in fast enough. It was going to cross the open floor. It was going to reach the girl, or the officer, or the knot of panicking travelers. The deterrent doesn't choose. It goes where the noise is loudest and the fear is thickest. That's the whole brutal logic of the thing, and there were going to be people on the floor who didn't get up. I didn't shout. I want that on the record because afterward people said I must have shouted, must have given some command, must have done something, and I didn't. There wasn't time and there wasn't a thing to shout. What I did was the only thing 40 years had left me to do. I dropped my hand to my dog's collar, not to hold him. You can't hold a thing that size if it's decided to go, just to be touching him, so that whatever happened, he'd know where I was. And I said, low, the way I'd say it on a porch at the end of a long day, "Easy, Boone." He was already up. I never saw him stand. That's the truth of it. One breath he was a gray heap across my boot, and the next he was on his feet between me and the open floor, 4 square, head level, and he had put himself there without hurry and without a sound, the way water finds the low place. He wasn't barking. Boone almost never barked. In 11 years I'd heard him bark perhaps a dozen times, and every one of them had meant something. He wasn't barking now. He was just standing, big and gray and old, square in the path of the thing that was coming, and he was looking at it. The grawl covered half the floor and saw him. I have tried in the years since to find the words for what happened in the next second, and I have never been satisfied with any of them. So I'll just tell you what I saw, and you can make of it what you make of it. The grawl stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. All that mass, all that silent speed, and it planted its forelimbs and dug furrows in the seamless gray floor and came up short so hard that the handler behind it lost the yoke entirely and went sprawling. It stopped maybe 4 meters from my dog, and then it did a thing I have never seen a predator do and never expect to see again. It lowered its head. Not to charge, the other way. It dropped the wedge of its skull until the jaw was near the floor, and it pulled its weight back over its haunches, and the great barrel of its chest, which had been filling and emptying like a bellows, went slow, and then slower, and the bone-white ridge along its spine, which had been standing up stiff, lay down flat. It made a sound I can only call a question, a low broken note up at the end, and it sat. It sat down on the bright floor of the Anseth, crossing 4 meters from an 11-year-old Mastiff, and it did not move again. Boone looked at it. The grawl looked at Boone, then looked at the floor, then looked at Boone and looked away again, the way a dog will when it has decided not to push a thing. And that was the part that put the cold down my own back, because I knew that look. I had seen my own dog give that look to bigger dogs at the door of a feed store. The "You're senior, I'm fine, we're fine" look. The look that keeps the peace in every pack that has ever existed. And I was watching an alien war beast, the size of a horse, give it to my old dog across a spaceport floor. Boone, for his part, did the most ordinary thing in the world. He held the other animal's eye for a moment, found it agreeable, and then he turned his head and looked up at me to see whether I needed anything further. I didn't. I put my hand back on his collar. "Good," I said. That was all. Good asterisk. He leaned a few pounds of his weight against my leg, which was his way, and we stood there, the two of us, in a hall that had gone completely, perfectly silent. You could have heard a coin drop in there, and there were a lot of coins, all that customs plating, and not one of them made a sound. The handler picked himself up off the floor. He didn't reach for the yoke. He stood there looking at his animal sitting quiet on the open concourse, an animal that by every protocol he'd ever been trained on should have been impossible to call back once it was loosed into a hot room, and the animal wasn't looking at him at all. It was watching Boone with the patient deference of a junior waiting to be dismissed. The handler's plating had gone very still. When a man stops fidgeting, he's finally paying attention. The young officer who had the girl had let go of her. I don't think he'd decided to. I think his hands had opened on their own when the room dropped, the way a man drops what he's holding when something larger demands all of him at once. She'd backed away to the wall and slid down it and was sitting on the floor with the locked case in her lap, breathing in the ragged way you breathe after, and nobody was looking at her anymore, and for once in that hall that was a mercy. The senior officer was looking at my dog. I'll give him this. He was a fool, but he wasn't a coward, and he wasn't slow once the facts had the decency to be undeniable. I watched him do the arithmetic. I watched him understand that his deterrent, The thing the station kept precisely for the worst moment, the final argument, the answer to every question that armed men couldn't answer, had taken one look at the unregistered apex, mass he'd been so eager to confiscate, and had sat down on the floor and yielded the room. I watched him understand that he had spent 10 minutes lecturing me about hazard classification, while standing next to a hazard his own instruments had never thought to measure, because it was old and gray and lying across an old man's boot, and his instruments had been built by people who believed, as he believed, that the dangerous thing is always the loud one. "Senior officer," I said into the quiet. I kept my voice exactly where it had been, ordering coffee. "I think we can finish the assessment now." He looked at me. "He passed," I said. I don't know if the translator carried the dry of it. I hope it did. But it didn't matter because the room had already understood, the whole hall of them, every species of them, and a thing the whole room understands doesn't need translating. Somewhere off to the left somebody made a sound that in any language is a laugh that escapes before you can stop it, the high helpless kind, and it was gone as fast as it came, but it had been there, and the officer had heard it, and a man who has been laughed at in his own hall by his own crowd is a man who is done arguing. "Clear them," he said. He didn't say it to me. He said it to the younger officer, the one who'd grabbed the girl, and he said it without looking at any of us, and then he turned and walked back through the arch with his collar band catching the bright light, and his plating made its sound, coins, all the way, until the arch swallowed him. The handler came over. He came slow, hands open and well away from the yoke which he'd left on the floor, and he stopped a respectful distance off, respectful of Boone. I understood, not of me, and he looked down at my dog for a long moment. "How old?" he asked. His translator was a better one than the officer's. It had texture. It sounded like a man who actually wanted to know. 11, I said, going on 12. 11 of your years. 11 of mine. He was quiet. Then he looked at his own animal still sitting where it had sat, and something moved in the set of his plating that I'd have called grief on a human face. "Ours run 20, he said. "I have had this one since it was small enough to carry. I have run it on 12 stations. I have seen it stop a thing that 9 officers could not stop. I have never seen it stop itself." He looked back at Boone. "It read something in yours that I cannot read. I would like to know what it was." I thought about that. I'm not a man who reaches for the grand answer, and I wasn't going to start in a spaceport with an alien who'd watched the same thing I had. So I told him the small, true thing instead. "He wasn't afraid," I said. "Your animal came across that floor expecting everything in the room to be afraid of it because everything in the room always is. That's what it's for. That's the whole machine of it. The fear comes first and the teeth come after, and most of the time the teeth never have to. And then it crossed the one thing in the room that wasn't afraid of it. Not brave. Brave's a different thing. Brave is fear you've decided to walk through. Mine wasn't brave. He just wasn't afraid. He didn't have it in him to be. He's an old dog from a hard world, and he stood in front of worse than your animal in his time, and he knew it, and your animal could smell that he knew it." I scratched Boone's ear and he leaned. "There's nothing for a predator to push against in a thing that isn't afraid. You take the fear away and all that's left is the question of who's older and who's seen more and who's standing his ground. Your animal asked the question and my dog answered it. That's all. That's the whole of it." The handler was quiet a long time. "What world?" he said at last. "Earth," I said. He said the word back, carefully in his own register. The way you'd handle a thing you'd been told was sharp. Then he looked at Boone one more time, and he did something with his head and his shoulders, a slow folding, that I'd come to learn was a Velnar way of marking respect to a thing they'd misjudged, and he went back to his animal and stood beside it, and he didn't pick up the yoke. The girl was still against the wall. I went over slow, Boone at my heel, and the whole concourse parting around us like a field around a stone, which I'll admit I didn't hate, and I crouched down in front of her the best my knees would allow, which wasn't much, and she looked up at me with her face all wrung out. "You hurt?" I asked. She shook her head. Then she looked past me at Boone, who had come up and sat down beside us and was regarding her with the mild, patient interest of a dog deciding whether a person is going to be interesting or just upset. And she made a sound that was half a laugh and half the other thing. And she put out a hand, and she stopped, and she looked at me to ask. "He's friendly," I said. She put her hand on his big gray head, and Boone shut his eyes and leaned into it the way he leaned into everybody who took the trouble. 190 pounds of the most dangerous thing in the building, going soft as warm bread under a courier girl's shaking hand. And she laughed for real that time, the laugh coming up through the tears and pushing them out of the way. "Is he yours?" she asked. "We're each other's," I said. "Long story, you headed for the Saw line." She was. Bonded courier, first long run, and they'd flagged her case at 3 of the last 4 stations because a young human alone with a locked case is the kind of thing that makes nervous men feel important, and she'd been frightened the whole way and trying not to show it and showing it anyway. I knew the road. I'd walked a version of it for 40 years. "Walk with us," I said. "They've cleared us through. Nobody's going to put a hand on you with him alongside, and if they try, well." I looked over at the Grawl, still sitting where it sat, still watching my dog with that careful sidelong deference. I expect the room remembers. We boarded together, the 3 of us, the old man and the courier girl and the dog, and we found seats in the rear of the transit car where there was room for Boone to stretch out across the aisle, which he did, with the long sigh of a dog who has decided the day went on far too long and is finally going to be allowed to end. The car filled. People came down the aisle and saw the gray heap of him taking up the floor, and they stepped over carefully, and not one of them complained. And a few of them Velnar, and a pair of small-scaled travelers I couldn't name, and one tall-robed thing that had to fold itself nearly double to fit the seats. A few of them slowed as they passed and looked down at him with an expression I'd seen on the handler. Not fear. Past fear. The look you give a thing when you've revised your understanding of it, and the revision cost you something. The girl fell asleep before we cleared the spire, the locked case hugged to her chest, the way the young sleep when the fear finally lets them go, all at once and without dignity and completely. Boone snored. He'd always snored. My wife used to say he sounded like the house settling, and she wasn't wrong, and I'd spent 4 years missing that sound at night. And I sat in the rear of an alien transit car a long way from any house I'd ever owned and listened to it, and was, for the first time in a good while, all right. I thought about the handler's question. I would like to know what it was. And I thought about how I'd answered it, the small true thing about fear, and how it was true but it wasn't the whole of it, and how the whole of it wasn't a thing I could have said to him because it wasn't a thing about my dog at all. Here's what I didn't tell him. Everything in that hall had been built by people who decided, somewhere down at the root of how they thought, that strength is the loud thing, the plating that made the coin sound, the height the Velnar held themselves at, the deterrent in the bay, 6 limbs and a wedge of jaw, kept behind glass so the whole concourse could see it and be afraid. They'd put the strength out where it showed, because to them the showing was the point. Strength that doesn't announce itself isn't strength to them. It's just an unmeasured hazard, a thing that hasn't filled out the right form. And we came from a world that taught us the opposite, taught it to us so far down that we don't even know we know it. The most dangerous things on earth are quiet. They are old and slow, and they lie in the sun. The thing that runs the river is the one that doesn't move. We learned, somewhere a long way back before any of us could write it down, that the calm thing is the thing to watch, that the animal that doesn't flinch is the animal that has nothing to flinch about, that the one who doesn't need to show you is the one you should never have crossed. And we bred it into the dogs that chose to walk beside us over thousands of years, on purpose and by accident both. Bred the calm right into the bone of them, so that now an old fawn Mastiff can lie across a man's boot in a hall full of giants and be, without doing a single thing, the most dangerous creature in the building. And the only ones who can read it are the other apexes, who speak the older language, the one that runs under the plating and the paperwork, the language where you don't ask a thing how big its teeth are. You ask whether it's afraid, and if it isn't, you sit down. The Grawl had asked. Boone hadn't been afraid, the Grawl had sat down. That's the whole of it. People want a grander story, and there isn't one. There never is. There's just an old man and an old dog going home, and a room full of people who'd forgotten that the quietest thing in the building is usually the one that was never going to lose. I don't expect they've forgotten it again. You don't forget the day the Deterrent knelt. The Anseth Crossing will tell that story for a long time, and they'll tell it wrong. The way rooms always do. They'll make my dog bigger and the Grawl fiercer and me braver than I was, because the true version is too plain to keep. The true version is that nothing happened. A dog stood up. Another animal looked at him and understood something and chose peace, which is the thing the calm ones almost always choose because they're the only ones who can afford to. Nobody bled. Nobody had to. That's not a story that survives the retelling. The room will want teeth in it eventually. The room always does. But I was there, and I'm telling it the way it was, while I still can. We made the Saw corridor 2 days later. The girl got off a stop ahead of us, at the relay where her bonded line ran. And before she went, she crouched down and put both arms around as much of Boone's neck as she could reach and pressed her face into the gray of him for a moment. And he stood for it, patient. The way he stood for everything that took the trouble to be kind to him. And then she straightened up and wiped her face and looked at me and didn't have words, and I told her she didn't need any, and she went. And then it was just the two of us again, the way it had been for 4 years, the way I suppose it'll be until it isn't. He's asleep at my feet as I tell you this. Gray all through the muzzle now, grayer than he was at Anseth, slow getting up in the mornings, slow on the stairs. There'll come a day, and it's not far, when the calm in him will be the calm of an old dog who's simply run out of road, and not the calm that made a war beast sit down on a spaceport floor. And on that day, I'll be the one who has to be the quiet thing, the one who has to not be afraid for his sake, because that's the deal we made, the dog and I. The deal everybody makes when they take one of these creatures in and let it become the last of their house. But that day's not today. Today he's snoring like the house settling, and the home we're going to is real and getting closer, and there isn't a thing in this galaxy, with all its plating and its protocols and its deterrents kept behind glass, that I'd trade for the weight of his chin across my boot. They mocked the slow old man and his slow old dog at the Anseth Crossing. They had a procedure for it. They should have asked their own animal first. It knew better than all of them, and it knew it on sight, and it told them the only way it could. It sat down,